Hello and welcome to a trustworthy new episode of the StudioMEcast. I'm your host, Peter Regan, joining you from StudioME. And if you like the look and sound of this podcast, well, you can book one of our spaces yourself at StudioME.me. And don't forget, we've opened our new location, the Meetup, which is located in Oakland, not too far from our home base here in East Liberty, Pittsburgh. So if you look at your screen, look at the B-roll. Isn't it a lovely space? Can't you imagine talking about something, anything in this with your friends, colleagues, whatever's enemies, perhaps? That would probably generate some traction. Anyway, point is, today I'm joined by John Finnell. He has worked on a bunch of projects. He was involved with the Avengers, Super 8, a series such as Mindhunter. He's involved with the Pale Blue Eye. But today we're going to be talking with him about writing because he's had an impact on me largely through writing, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, join us on with the show. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I've wanted to have you on for a long time.
Yeah.
But there was something that kept me from inviting you on the podcast for all, because we've been doing the podcast. I have to look back. I'm not sure how long it's been since we officially started this podcast, but I've wanted to have you on for a very long time, but the thing that kept me from doing that is I think the last time you and I were around each other actually was you had recommended a book to me about writing. Yeah. And I got a copy of the book, and then, as it is with me, kept pushing it back and then read it very slowly. Finally got this thing finished, and I also like to annotate books while I read them if they're not historical valued. Anyway, but I like notes, underline, highlight, whatever. But something that I did right after, there's something else I did right after you and I met in person, the last time we were around each other, which was you had been, I met with you because I needed some advice. This was years ago. I think this was
like 2017 or 2018.
I think it might have been 2015, actually.
Really?
It was a while ago.
Could have been that far
We're
back.
About to find out when it was, actually, because what happened was I was freelancing before I worked here, and someone had offered me a contract to do some freelancing stuff. And I knew that you had done some stuff in film and movies and all that. And I asked for, hey, I don't know any entertainment lawyers. I don't know if, can you just give me some advice on this? You and I met up. We went through the contract. You kind of walked through it with me. And I dodged an enormous bullet by not signing this thing.
Because I am not a lawyer.
I know. But
I probably should not be allowed to look at any contract about anything.
Well, it wasn't official legal advice, but you're like, here's kind of what this is implying, maybe, and all that. And it was very much a trap, is what the contract was. I had worked with the person once or twice before, and then they're like, hey, I want to sign a contract with you to make all this stuff. And I was like, I'd really like to get more work and all that, but I also had heard horror stories, and I almost had one. So as a thank you, I went and got something, and then, immediately, right after that. And then didn't see you for years, and life happened, moving, married, whatever, and just, I don't know, putting stuff off. And also wanting to finish reading that book. Self-imposed
Into the Woods, right?
Yes, yeah. That book that you recommended, Into the Woods, a 5-act journey into story by John York. This is my personal copy, but I have here something for you. Wow, surprise.
You have a gift for me?
I have a gift for you, John.
Get out of here.
Yeah, now, I did open it because I wanted to check something. I wanted to make sure that it was what I had ordered, but go ahead and...
Oh, this is great.
Big surprise.
Look at this.
I know.
I can't believe it.
This has been so long in the making for me to do this. Look in the inside cover.
Oh, man, that means so much to me. How on earth did you get this signed by this guy? You reach out to him?
I did. I had never done a wire transfer before. It was a whole thing. It was a whole thing. Before you go into this, for anyone who can't
see this. It's signed by the author with my name on it, which is wild.
That's what I wanted to check, is to make sure that you put your name on it.
That you paid him and he did it.
Yeah. So that I think there's probably on the postage there. He lives in the UK.
Yeah.
So it's got the late Queen Elizabeth on the stamp.
I see that.
And somewhere there's a date that I think is like, it's 20-something before 20 teens, something like that.
Amazing.
So this is it's so satisfying to be here now and to see this in your hand, because it's been on my desk and on my shelf, and I've been like, oh yeah, I got to give that to this guy. And then I'm like, oh, I should have him on the podcast. And I'm like, oh, this will be a great thing. And then it took like, I take a long time to read stuff on occasion.
Thank you for this. Is amazing. And the inscription is beautiful. Mm-hmm. I'll read it for everybody else. It says, "Dear John Finnell, for the lines you write in the lives of others, John York." Incredible.
Mm-hmm. So very apt, because big thank you to you, because I would have probably desperately signed that contract, and who knows where I would be today, or where they'd be in my desperation. So, but this brings out, I really want to talk with you about writing, because I've sent you at least one script before for a film that I eventually produced, a short.
Yeah.
You gave me great feedback on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's also, you recommended the podcast Script Notes to me, which I listened to on occasion. Yep. And Craig Mazin. Yep. And I listened to that. I will just kind of bleed into different episodes, you know?
Yeah.
And then this book as well. So I want to talk with you about writing.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I want to do with this huge, awesome intro is say, there's something that I heard about you that I think is really what solidified in my mind that you're a writer. Just something that Missy told me years ago. Your wife, Missy, for those of you not following, who's been on a previous episode.
Right, yeah, watch that episode.
Yeah, check out Missy's. It's a fun one. We talk about Veggie Tales and all kinds of... And
this will be nothing in comparison to that.
Well, we'll see. But she told me, I think her favorite book is The Wizard of Oz.
Right.
And that you, as a gift to her, correct me if I'm remembering this right, it kind of burned itself in, so it's probably correct. You wrote an adaptation, a feature-length adaptation script based on the book of The Wizard of Oz for her as a gift.
Yeah.
That's amazing to me.
Yeah, I did that, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Can I ask you a little bit about that?
Yeah, whatever you want.
How long did that take you to do?
Yeah, that one, it's insane. It only took like a week.
Really?
Here's the thing. I was up against a super tight deadline. I had no money, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I knew she loved that book, and I had read that book in the fall, and we're coming up towards Christmas, and I had like a few gifts, but she goes bonkers at Christmas. So I just did not know what to get her. So I was like, okay, I'm going to work on this.
Bonkers in the gift-giving department?
Yeah, like she'll go way
Allie's
overboard.
the same way.
That's her love language. She'll go way overboard. Mm-hmm. And it's great to be on the receiving end of it, but sometimes it's a little too much. I'm like, I don't have, you know what I mean? Like you feel like you're not prepared for the holiday almost. Well, maybe you don't. If you give a lot, you're on the other end of this.
I've had to get creative.
Sure.
But
she's excellent at gift giving. The best. Simply the best. And I feel very privileged and loved. But in that, I'm like, okay, well, I need to figure out something. I have a few gifts, but nothing that really, stands out. And I'm more of someone who likes to give in a creative area, something unique to the individual, as opposed to just materialistic things, right? Like some people are gift givers in the sense where, like a gift card suffices. Nothing wrong with that, right? But I'm like, okay, well, she loves The Wizard of Oz, so I'm just going to write a feature version of it. So I did it really fast, and in my opinion, I don't think it's very good. Missy will tell you the opposite. She'll tell you that she thinks it's the best thing I've ever written. I think it's too long. It's really punchy. It's not very good. The only thing I will give credit for it is it has an original opening and an original ending. Because that book, what's beautiful about it, and I don't know if have you ever read it?
I think I've like read through. There was one version of it's been so long I can't like remember anything. I remember some of the differences from the movie.
Sure.
Right, like the slippers aren't rubies. The witch isn't green. That kind of thing.
Sure.
But I don't remember too much about it.
So I'll give you like and for everyone else, just like a quick like rundown of what it is. So it's originally written in 1901 by L. Frank Baum. Wrote it for his wife, who had all boys, and she desperately wanted a girl, and they had a niece named Dorothy who died at like age 2 of brain cancer.
Wow.
And he wrote the original book for his wife to have adventures of her niece Dorothy that could live on. So he wrote a whole series of these books, right? There's several of them. And that first one, what's really unique about it, when you read it, at least for me, my interpretation of it is that it's clearly about a young girl that died. The silver shoes, like when people would die in the 1800s and earlier, they'd put silver coins on the eyes as like a passing from one realm to another. Mm-hmm. Be like a way of like paying passage, or like a ticket, if you will, to get from one end to the other. Mm-hmm. And the silver shoes always felt like a reference to that. So when I read that book, I didn't interpret it the way that the movie interprets it, as this like Kansas that's very black and white, and then she's in a world of color, and then she returns from a dream. To me, it felt like there's a tornado and a young girl dies in a tornado and then goes off to this purgatory of some sort. And then at the very end, she's reunited with her family. And the way that the end reads does not read like the movie's ending reads, right? The movie's ending reads, and she wakes up and she's with all the people that she's seen in this world, and it's all very familiar. But the way that the ending feels is like she's returned like home. Right? Like as if not Kansas. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have that kind of feel to it.
Right.
It's hard to explain, but it gives you this very subtle idea that she's gone on to another world of heaven, if you will. So that was my interpretation whenever reading it. I didn't go super heavy with it. You can like the ending kind of maybe gives away that it's there. But that was how I approached it. And Missy loved it. And that was really the point, was that she would enjoy a book that was, some kind of classic literature that could be adapted. And it's out of copyright, pretty sure, because it's like over 100 years old. Mm-hmm. So I felt comfortable writing it and was like, no one's going to, if it ever became anything or whatever, which it hasn't, but no one could sue over that kind of thing.
Right.
And if they would, I wouldn't be prepared to handle that lawsuit anyway.
Well, thank you for telling us that story. That's such a cool, just what a unique thing too.
Yeah, thanks.
It's really, and when I heard that story, that told me also that you've probably written more than one feature-length screenplay then at this point, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit, just give me just give me some of your story. Like, how'd you get into writing? Like, did it start with writing for movies as the idea, or were you starting with poetry? Like, where did you get into writing? Yeah,
I heard I watched the other episode that you'd done with the guy who had done poetry. I'm blanking
Chris.
on his name. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great podcast. Watched it. A lot of fun.
Oh, thank you.
I've not really a poetry person. I understand it. I just read a bunch of medieval poetry. I like poetry. But I guess let me back up. I'm not a professional writer yet. That has always been my goal at this point, has been to just get paid to write. When I went to film school, I really just wanted to be a director and writer. When I graduated, it became pretty apparent to make pictures, and I know you know this, it's a lot more difficult to rally people together and get everyone there if you don't have equipment and you're not able to pay everybody to do it, and it just takes so much effort. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I knew I wasn't going to be able to pull off doing that anymore. You know, the kind of stories that I had, they weren't cheap. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to rally a whole crew together to make stuff, that I'd be on my own. But I also didn't have any equipment. It didn't seem feasible. So writing seemed like the most feasible option to make movies that were just on paper. Mm-hmm. You know, the software costs like $100 some bucks, and the only other thing it costs is my time. So I jumped into it there. I wrote my first feature in 2010. And after that, I became a little hooked on it. I'm on my 14th at the moment.
Wow.
So that's the one thing I can, say that I could give advice on, is how to keep writing material, right? Mm-hmm. But as far as like being able to write professionally, I'm not quite there yet. Mm. But I've written, it took years of writing and failing and still failing, just to figure out like where I'm at and how I'm doing things. I can confidently say after, 13 screenplays, I'm way more comfortable writing now. I know my genre that I like to write in. I know what I like to, the themes I like to take on, how I like to approach things. When I left film school, I was going straight into the film business. So I was PAing on major movies, and I wanted to keep creating stuff. So I set a goal where I would write one script per year. Mm-hmm. That was the goal. I've pretty much kept with that. Some years it's a little off where like I don't, but then like the following year I'll knock 2 out or something to that extent. And that became just a way for me to keep going, to not have that like existential dread of not being able to be a Hollywood filmmaker, something to that extent. So it took years, but I finally figured out, maybe after the 4th or 5th script, that I liked writing comedy. But I didn't keep writing comedy after that. I wrote that Wizard of Oz script was the second thing I ever wrote.
As far as features.
As far as features go. Yeah, the first one was again, it lives in that adaptation world. I took an adaptation of a Shakespeare play. Oh,
fantastic. Love Shakespeare.
I took King Henry IV, which has the Hal storyline of for those who don't know, it's the prince that wants to be rebellious and not be with his dad and go hang out with bums on the street. So I took that and adapted it into this like 1960s Pittsburgh world, where this kid's dad like runs streetcars, because that used to be a thing here in the city that no longer exists. And I did a whole bit on that. Drama, it's not good. It's not good at all. It's interesting. The idea is interesting, but it's a terrible script. It took a few screenplays to figure out that I like doing comedy. I wrote a buddy comedy. I wrote it really, really fast. And then after that, I kept writing different stuff just to see what I could do. Mm-hmm. Wrote horror, sometimes, just to clarify, sometimes it's not always features. Sometimes there's like a 60-minute pilot that might be in there, or a spec script, something to that extent. I worked on the show Mindhunter for a little bit, and I ended up writing a spec off of that show that was really good. But after all these scripts, I finally wrote this big, like, long war epic.
Which war?
It's the Second World War. It was based on my grandfather's journey. So my grandfather, was an Italian who lived in Pittsburgh, and his best friend was Jewish, and I wanted to write this story about him being in Papua New Guinea, Pacific Theater, and, going, because him and his best friend Saul, when the draft was occurring, I don't think my grandfather was drafted, but he, like, volunteered, because FDR was really pushing the whole bill for the GI Bill. Sorry, I was totally blanking on what it is. The GI Bill, right? So he's like pushing the GI Bill, and my grandfather's like, yeah, that sounds great. We'll just go march. Had no idea that they would be in battle.
Yeah.
Right? So then like they go, and he's in these like history books, you can read about the specific troop that they were in over the years, building these like huts in New Guinea. There being like natives, them trading cigarettes for bananas, and Japanese just like flying overhead and bombing everything that they have the whole time. Quite fascinating. So I wrote a whole story on this, and it took months. I wrote it during the pandemic, did a ton of research, and then by the time I was done, I'm like exhausted with it. And Missy is like, why don't you write what you like? Like, what are you good at writing? What was the most fun you ever had writing something? Because at this point, I've written, 12 scripts. And comedy was the one thing that I had written about, 8 screenplays back at this point, you know? And I'm like, yeah, I guess, the comedy was the best thing. So I've stuck with that. And it's great because there's a lot of elements of comedy that I can get into, different areas that I can write with comedy. There's dark comedy, there's satire, there's slapstick, there's all kinds of things. You can dress comedy up any way that you like it. So I took advantage of that, and I've stayed with that. So the last script that I wrote, which is probably the best thing I wrote, dark comedy called Over Easy, which is about this high school history teacher that compulsively murders prostitutes.
Hilarious. Love it.
Well, everything is funny depending on how you look at
Absolutely.
it. Right.
Yeah.
So this was more of an approach about like a character that has a compulsion that he's hiding in plain sight. He sits down here, has this kind of an interview, but once he gets in the car, he's a murderer. So I love this idea of someone carrying this kind of thing around and going through their day-to-day life, or, teaching children about the Civil War. But like 5 minutes ago, we watched them, strangle a prostitute in the car. It seemed very, just very dark, but also very relatable. Most people aren't murderers, but most people have something that they do that they don't want to talk about when they go out in public. It always seemed like a thing. Everyone has that little thing that they're embarrassed about or whatever. So to me, it seemed very relevant in general. And I just took that from my own experience and was like, oh, I can apply it to this character because it makes sense. It's an extreme, but I can apply it.
That's a great insight too. Yeah, because does the character like being a teacher? Is that part of it at all?
Yeah, I mean, he's good at it, right? So it's a thing that he's good at. I guess he enjoys it. I don't know if I ever really got into the details of that.
Yeah.
Where it really comes into play is that the whole story ends up being that character botches a murder. Ooh. And then there's a detective that's like kind of on his heels the whole time. And he's really good at dodging everything. And he's so good that he can get away from the detective no problem. But everything starts to unravel when he meets this girl who is a student, who is a transgender student that's homeless. And everything just starts to unravel when he takes her in. And then there's this emotional element of the whole story. So wrote the script, loved the script, didn't do well anywhere. But I'm not like done with it. I think it's at a professional level. So I have the next script that I'm writing, and I'll be working on that. And once I'm done, I'll feel pretty comfortable like soliciting, at like agencies, because film festivals and things like that, that's just like a barrier between you and an agent. That's really all that it is, at least for writing.
You mean by barrier, do you mean like if you have a screenplay that performs well at a festival that can help with getting an agent? Is that what you mean? Or,
yeah. So like I say festival, it's a broad term though, like the Nickel Fellowship or things like that, right? They're just areas where you can access people that are in the industry. Right. For those who are not in the industry, which I've been doing, but it also doesn't make sense because I am in the industry. Like I'm a member of IATSE. I work on, you can find my IMDb. I work on big pictures. I meet producers. I meet actors. So it's like, I keep doing this, but it's like I'm already in the living room of the party, and I keep trying to leave and go through the back door to come back in because I'm just trying to make it to the back room where the VIP room is. Yeah. And instead of like just walking through the house, I keep leaving and trying to go around the other end. Most people aren't inside, right? They're on the lawn. So they're trying to find a way to get inside. And festivals, things like that, that's a way to do it. Because you present your material and you have a bunch of judges that do the criteria on it, and they're like, you're on a semi-professional, professional level, we'll let you in. And then that gives you, at least in writing, and then that gives you like an opportunity to meet people. Like if you do well on the nickel, on a first draft, right? Like our first round, right? You're set up with like 6-7 interviews at agencies.
Oh, fantastic.
Immediately.
Wow.
But then the advice would be that if you go ahead and do that, you need to have something else, because your material probably is not good enough to get you to be a finalist, right? And even if it's not, the next thing they ask you is like, well, what else do you have? And that's your one moment where it's like, if you don't have something that someone's looking for, it's over. The moment's gone. You have to figure it out. You have to start from square one.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, it's like those video games where, it's just a full run, and once you fall in, it's like back to.
It's a Souls game.
Yeah,
it's like Dark Souls.
So, well, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was, I think you like when you were talking about the screenplays you've been written, you were talking about trialing, and you used the word failing. Yeah. I don't want to hang on it too much if it's not that big a deal, but like, what did you mean by that?
Sure. Well, I think people have failure as a negative connotation, right? They think that's not a good thing. Failure just means that you have attempted something and you have not gotten your desired outcome, whatever that is, right? So a failure for you could be, I want to do 50 push-ups. You get to 49. Right? That's a failure. You didn't make it to 50.
For me, that might be a pretty good thing. I'm kidding.
Well, no, but that's exactly the thing, right?
Like, the goal. Right.
Well, but what you just said is exactly the thing, right? So like for you, if you hit 49, depending on how you look at it, right? You could say, well, I didn't get to 50, so that's a failure, but also at the same time, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It means you did 49 push-ups. That's a great thing, right? You did them all in a row. That's maybe something to celebrate. Failures are something to celebrate because they teach you something. There's always something to gain from not succeeding. In fact, I would almost say that a success is almost scarier than a failure, because at least you know where you stand with a failure, right? So in my case, writing, a failure could be a number of things, and they have been. Sometimes I finish a script and I'm like, it's not very good. I've taken all this time to write it. I've done everything that I thought was right. I get through it and I can look at it and be like, it's not a very good script. Or I think it's great. I submit it off to a place like the Blacklist and they come back with like a 4 rating, 4 out of 10. And they're like, no, it's not very good. So those I think are how I mean with failures. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an awful thing or that I'm a failure. Right.
Because when I had figured you had written more than one feature script before, but I didn't realize you were like in the double digits with it, And for me, because I've written at least one feature-length screenplay script, and so I have some. Not all of them are the same level of difficult or whatever, but I have some sense of understanding of like how hard it is to do that, and that you've done so many of those. Is really remarkable to me. And one of the things that I've said to at least one other person on this podcast before is I used to, when I would write short scripts for like short films, and not, I mean, I still do, but like before I was like making any of them, it's like, cause I could write before I could make any videos. And so I was like, all right, well, I'll just write this stuff. And whenever I wrote anything that I didn't end up being able to produce, even after I started making like short films and videos or whatever like that, if I wrote something and then didn't make it for a while, that like really, really frustrated me because I'm like, this is a bloody waste of time, But eventually I realized, no, for me, I'm still working with story. I'm still writing. I'm still doing this thing and getting familiar with this craft. Like I'm still playing with it and learning from it a whole lot. And I mean, I'll get that from writing a short, The amount of just experience and familiarity that you have to have accrued at this point from writing that many features has got to be pretty awesome. I don't know if you take a second to step back and see like I don't know if you read like your first thing compared to your later stuff and see there's probably been at least some improvement in your eyes for that. That's got to be a gratifying experience.
Yeah, there's definitely improvement. Mm-hmm. I've looked at the very first thing I was talking about, right? That Shakespeare piece. I've read it and been like, this is not, just like tossed it and been like, wow, I can't believe someone gave me a B as like a final project because it was a final project in school. Mm-hmm. I would have failed me. But yeah, for myself, I can see a progression. Mm-hmm. But that's also that has to be a personal success, and that has been a success. I do feel I've gotten better. Mm-hmm. There's milestones, whenever it comes to writing. I think the first one is that you actually write your first feature. You complete it. That doesn't, most of the time it's not going to be good. 98% of the time. There's like 2% of people in the whole world that would write their very first feature and it would be a success. It really does not happen.
Right.
I think even like William Goldman, who's like one of the great screenwriters, had to get into the double digits like myself before he finally sold. Mm-hmm. And I understand it because you have to have this, I understand it now. You have to have this callousness to everything that you do in order to have it be successful. I used to write scripts, when you're in film school or when you're like reading books on screenplays, they're like, short descriptions, you can't write paragraphs, it has to be like this. And I'm like, fuck it, and I just write whatever I want anymore, at least on this last script. Because the last one I wrote, I tried doing that. I was short, concise. I read a bunch of professionally made screenplays and was like, okay, that's how they do it. That's great. Then I ended up reading something by Lawrence Kasdan. Actually, it was for Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you've never read that, you should, to see that Lawrence Kasdan didn't care at all about what the norms are for writing screenplays. And he'd have these paragraphs that he would write things in, and his own voice would be in there. And I'm like, yeah, that's how you break the rules. That's not like they tell you like, don't write over 3 lines for a paragraph. And he's writing like 9 or 10 lines. He doesn't care at this point. But I think you only get there when you've had enough failure.
Yeah.
Because that failure helps you become, it's really a success. It helps you become the kind of writer that you're going to end up being.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes it's really tempting for people, especially when they're starting out, to want to break rules before they've gotten a familiarity with any art form.
Oh, yeah.
Or any craft. It's like before... A few people have asked me for advice over the years on filmmaking, and one of the things that I've mentioned to people a couple times is before you get really even paying attention to, of having your own voice as an artist with filmmaking, make sure that you can work with a film first. It's like, can you tell don't worry about if your work's cliche or like derivative. It's like when you're starting out, just see if you can do this. Like, can you make a joke land with a film? Because there's a lot that goes into that. There's the writing, there's the performance, the editing, the direction, where the camera is can affect how funny, if funny at all, the joke is. It's like, it's kind of a miracle anytime anybody laughs. And it's even crazier how often it does happen.
Sure.
But so often, especially like when I was in film school, and it just, in general, it's really common to see people wanting to have their own voice. It's like, yeah, but you haven't got a grasp on the medium yet. It's like you're trying to get experimental with this before you've done anything. And it's like, is that really what you want to actually do as a filmmaker at this point, or do you also want to make films that people might enjoy? It's that's something that, and it's not just film. Like when I was in art school, that's something that I ran into a lot with people, especially in freshman year of art school, was, oh, well, I want to draw the way I want to draw. It's like, okay, but you should probably learn about perspective, right? So like there's that curve with people, particularly in drawing in art school, where oh, I was the artsy kid in high school and my parents thought I was great. And then you get there and you realize that you don't really know how to draw. It's like you might have some drive to actually get a pencil on something, which is maybe most of it. But there's, realizing that there's this form, there's this craft that has existed before you, and there's a lot of ground that's been covered already, and making sure that you can walk in that before trying to reinvent the wheel, is something that important lesson, I think, for people.
Well, you hit the nail right on the head when you said the word craft, because I've thought about this a lot. And when you're in the arts of any sort, whether it's acting or filmmaking, or you're a painter or you're a writer, if you're trying to do that for a livelihood, you're no longer seeking a profession or a hobby. That is truly defined as a craft. It's different from a profession, because anybody could go out and get a profession. You could be a professional burger flipper. That's not hard. There's a certain art to it, but like that's not, anybody could go ahead and do that.
They can train you on the job.
They could train you on the job, sure, but like a craft goes well beyond that. Like I had years of film school. I understood structure. I understood storytelling. It was a great catalyst for understanding writing. Everything else had, like that book, I had to find that book on my own and study the Into the Woods, the 5 structure on my own. And then truly understand how to build a proper script. It's mainly been self-taught. The film school, I don't want to knock it and say it wasn't important, but most of it is like what you figure out on your own. It's the trial and error. And at the end of the day, that becomes a craft. It's way more specific than an art form or a profession. It's both things put together that creates craft.
Well, I want to talk with you a bit more about your features here and just your process for writing this. So you talked about how you're averaging a feature film a year, writing. And now for that, have you ever gotten pretty far with one and then just scrapped it and started a new idea?
All the time.
Yeah?
And that's not the stuff I'm counting. There's probably more of those than there are the numbers I'm giving you.
Have there ever been any that you scrapped it to write something else but then came back to one of those old ones?
Yeah, I've done that. I've done that on the one I'm currently on.
What made you scrap that one and what made you come back to it? Yeah,
I always think it's about where the idea is, like where it's incubated. There's a process. You come, like most of the scripts that I end up writing, I've had the idea for a long time. It's very rare that I come up with the idea and then I just churn out the script right then and there. Sometimes I have the idea, I have the script, the whole movie comes to me in my head, and then it's actually like left, and I don't even remember it. I don't know what it is. And at the time, I'm like, oh, that could be really, really fun. But if I forget to write it down, then it's absolutely gone. But a script that I usually end up writing is an idea that will like come to me, and then I'll keep it around for quite a while. That one I told you, the last one that I wrote about the high school teacher, right? I came up with that idea when I was in college. A culmination of things kind of came together, and it just fit into the right place. But I didn't write it for another like 12 years, longer, So
you tend to, I like to compare stuff to like, I like to compare film and I like to compare different crafts together, I should say. Mozart, when he would write, my understanding, I wasn't there, was that he would come up with the music before he wrote anything down. Like he didn't really work ideas out on paper too much. It was his, his music, when he wrote it out, was just perfect. There was no like changes because he would write it in his head. And then I think the morning or the same day that Don Giovanni premiered, he finally wrote out the prelude or the overture for it and then gave it to the musicians like the same day. Like he had written it, in his head. He had it there, but then just would finally get it all out there, and then they had to sight read it. You know?
Sure.
So that kind of sounds more like your process, where you come up with the idea more before you start even writing it down.
I mean, I'm no Mozart, you know, and nobody is. I guess it kind of works like this. It's a give or take. Like the idea I'm working on now is a script called Sun Drunk. Mm-hmm. It's a comedy noir, right? And I came up with the idea 2 years ago. After I'd finished that last script, called Over Easy. So after I'd finished that, I was looking for a new project to do. I didn't know what to do. I had no clue. I felt super lost. And I went to the pool. I'd just been thinking and like trying to write stuff all day, and it just like wasn't, this is where some of those scripts come in, where I start writing and then I abandon them, right? It's in those like weird places. And so I was like, I'm not going to work on anything for a week. I was like, I'm just walking away from it. So I went to the pool, had a bunch of drinks, and stayed out in the sun way too long. And when I left, I felt woozy, and I didn't feel great. And I was listening to 90s music. And I'm like, I told myself, I was like, I feel sun drunk. And I'm like, is that a word? And I looked it up, and it is a word, right? Which means exactly what you think it is. You know, you get woozy because you've been out in the sun way too long. And suddenly that's when an inspiration for an idea hit, right? Where I'm like, I got this great idea about this kid who doesn't know what he wants to do with his life and pool hops into other people's pools, right? And that's what he does. So for me, right, like Mozart has this idea and he's going to think on it. He's like Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, right? Chaucer comes up with that story. He died before he could finish it, but he doesn't do any draft. He just writes it and it comes out. I don't know what their processes are. What mine ends up being, though, is that idea came to fruition, and I started immediately doing research, tried writing it, started writing out an outline, and it did not click. And I knew it didn't click. I'm at a point now, after writing so many, that I know if it's working or not. If the idea does not seem to be landing, I can just feel it. It's an instinctual thing. And so I'll walk away from it. I'll shelve it for a minute. And I did for that one. And it's kind of rare that I end up doing that anymore, because usually the ideas are so old, they've been sitting around with me for so long, that writing them isn't really that much of a problem. This one, it's just like too fresh. So I abandoned it and then would come back to it and try rewriting it, and I knew it wasn't sticking, and then I'd put it away again. This past time, I finally went back to it after it's been 2 years, and just something clicked on this one. And I had a correct opening with a whole different character, and I knew how I was going to open it. And I knew after writing the opening scene, I was like, that's it. Actually, I started with it as an outline. Again, I'd already outlined it. I'd done, because when I outline, this is the process. The idea comes to mind, and for me, whenever I start writing, I'll write out a log line, just one sentence. Because my idea is, if I can't write it in a sentence, there's no way I could write it in 90 pages. After that, I'll write out all the plot points. So it's like 5 sentences. Try to tell the story that way. And there's rewriting, and there's messing around with it, and writing is rewriting, right? That's like my one philosophy. I have several, but that's one of them, that writing is rewriting. And I'll just keep going on with it, and then eventually those 5 sentences will turn into like 5 pages. And then from there, I'll feel comfortable actually like outlining a beat board, if you will. There's one on Final Draft that you can use. And I use that. It's like a digital note card system. If you've ever heard of writers using the note cards, where they write every scene out on a note card and they pin it up on a board. So after reading Into the Woods, John York talks about this mirror method, where he believes that like the biggest action in the story occurs right in the middle. So up until that point, everything's getting to the middle, and then it's mirrored on the other end, coming all the way back down. And I use that method because it helps to tell the drama so much. So the note card method makes a lot of sense, trying to piece that together. Because if you have a note card here, you could have a mirroring one here of something happens on the opposite end, right? This guy's getting angry that this is happening, and over here he finally does something about it, right? and it makes for a good drama. It really helps with plot. So it's like creating a roadmap. So by the time I'm done doing a whole beat board and get that whole thing out, I've got it. Then I finally feel comfortable jumping in and actually writing scenes. And it takes a while to get there. Not too long, maybe like a week or so. But I won't just jump in to start writing the story. Because to me, writing a script is like taking a road trip from New York to LA. You need a map in order to get there. If you go without a map, you might be able to do it, but it could be a little weird.
Yeah, it's over there somewhere.
Somewhere, yeah. You start like kind of floundering, and then you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
For me, I'd written...
Might ask for directions or feedback.
Maybe, yeah. I'd written this beat board out a year earlier, maybe even longer. And I had it, and it just wasn't working. I was sticking way too close to the map, if you will, on how to do it. And so when revisiting it, I was like, I'll do another outline. And that outline, instead of outlining it, it just turned into writing the script again. But this time I was like diving headfirst into it, and I haven't stopped since then. So it's been like, it's relatively fresh. It's been like, 2 weeks, and I'm already into the second act, and it's working, and I'm like, hey, it's finally clicking.
And the second act of 5?
Of 5,
yeah. That's one of the things from this book also that, like it's in the title, a 5-act journey into story. And what you mentioned about the midpoint being the significant moment, something that John York also mentions is a lot of the time that's where an enormously important new piece of information comes into the story.
Sure.
And I was like, that's an interesting, oddly specific thing to say. And that, I think, was my big takeaway from reading the book, was that concept, I think, like within the 5-act structure. But I was like, let me test that. And so as I've been watching movies, something will like happen, and I'll just pause it. And like a new piece of information, I'll just pause it, and it will be like...
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle. It's weird. And one of the spooky thing, that happened with my film.
Yeah.
My feature. I wasn't thinking like, at the midpoint, this has to happen. I was like trying to... someday I'll tell everyone what my process for writing my film was, but it'll have to get finished first, probably. I don't know. But it's like, it's right smack dab in the middle. This huge thing happens. That's like, it's a new bit of information, all that. And it was like, man, this guy's really, plugging into something here. It's weird because it happened with my script without me specifically going for that.
Sure.
Which is a lot of what the book's about, which is like, is story something that exists outside of us, or is it, it's very, it's a good read, people. Pick it up. So real quick, when you write, do you ever write by hand?
No. I take, I'll write ideas. I have a little notebook where I'll write things down by hand for ideas. Is it lined,
or is it a sketchbook?
It's I write in specifically in Moleskines.
Moleskines?
I have tons of them.
Okay.
Those notebooks with the hardbacks on them. So I have like a daily journal. I have like a work journal. I have a daily or weekly planner journal. I have specifically a film and TV journal. So and I've been doing this lately, any movie or TV show I watch, I'll take notes while I'm watching it and then like review it after it's over. But then I have this little notebook that I just write down random ideas on so I don't forget them. And I'll do the same for my characters, and I'll like reference them, because for me there's another aspect besides Into the Woods that I've been following to understand character quads and archetypes and things like that. And I'll write it down in the notebook to remind myself of how they work, what the dynamic pieces are. But other than that, it's all been inside of Final Draft. That's really what I use. Because the way that I look at it is, I want to be a professional screenwriter, so I want to take the work seriously and pay for professional material to work off of. Right. Right? It's sort of like a fake it until you make it kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you ever write shorts?
Now, I've written like one short, maybe. I wrote a lot more shorts back in college. When I got out of school, I thought no one's going to pay me professionally to write shorts. So I've mainly just stuck with feature screenplays and not really went away from screenplays either. really just stuck with writing feature scripts because that's all I really wanted to sell, and that's all I wanted to do. And now I have like a whole new goal because I think the theater is trash. So I just want to see stuff that's not bad going into the cinema anymore. So now it's a whole new goal. So I've never really gone over to shorts. I've mainly stayed there. I wrote a short for a friend about a year or two ago. And that was fun. I did it in like a week or so. There's a thrill in the feature world for me.
Yeah.
It gets kind of complicated, and you can write a lot of character and get a lot of character development. I'm not knocking shorts, though, just to be very clear, because I think being able to tell a short film is actually more complicated than trying to tell a feature film, because it's easy to make a bad short. It's not easy to make a really good short. And when you see, sometimes you'll even see professional filmmakers, like Brian Glazer is one of them. He's the filmmaker who did Birth, and he did the Holocaust film that came out this past year. I think it's called like Into the Zone.
Zone of Interest.
Zone of Interest,
Yeah.
That's it. He had a short film that like randomly he did after like Sexy Beast and after Birth. And it's like 5 minutes long, but it's amazing. It's truly incredible. And I don't think there's any dialogue in it. But what a triumph. You tell a story in 5 minutes and it's interesting to watch, and you walk away with a profound interest in it. That takes a lot. You know, it's really difficult to do that.
It's a completely, I'm kind of the opinion that shorts versus features, they're just two completely different, almost completely different mediums.
Totally.
You know, like, I had done a lot of, short films, home videos and stuff before I tried to make a feature. And in a lot of ways, just the experience of working on a feature was so completely different than anything that had happened with short film video stuff that I was like, I'm not sure it even really prepared me in any way, which, I'm still processing that. But, I was curious about if you had written shorts or if that was something you do, but having your love be fixated with features makes a lot of sense, because I feel the same way about like, directing stuff. It's I know that like my thing is features for sure. Like even with the experience I've had, that's how I feel. But the have you ever, now this is we've talked about the stuff that you do, that like your work for it. Do you ever collaborate with writers? Have you ever like gotten into a writing room with people, whether it's independent or not?
Not really. Sometimes, I guess it's all really a collaboration at the end of the day. Like, I'll talk to Missy a lot about like what I'm writing, or talk to somebody about what I'm writing, and they'll give their opinion like while I'm in the middle of it, and in that respect, that's sort of like a collaboration, because sometimes people give great ideas when you're in the middle of stuff, and I'll just snatch it and be like, and I'll tell them and be like, I'm going to steal that.
But it's not like you get in a room around a table with a whiteboard and like 5 people trying to write a thing.
Most of the time, no, that's not how it happened. The very first script I ever wrote was when I was 14, right? And I wrote it with one of my best friends. And that was about the only time I ever had a collaboration. I rewrote that script. That was the first comedy I ever wrote. Buddy comedy, kind of like an 80s sex comedy is really what it was, which they're like outdated now. They really don't exist, but I'm still rooting for them because they're always relevant in my opinion.
Bring it back at some point,
I feel that it will eventually.
Yeah.
Maybe not right now, but down the pike it will, And with that, the only way that I collaborated again was I would write and then turn it over to him and be like, what do you think? And he would make adjustments. And then I'd take what I liked and add it. But I've never really had like an actual writing partner to sit down and go over things with. I'm not opposed to it. It's just never presented itself. No one's ever been like, hey, do you want to collaborate on this idea together, or something to that extent. I'm always open to things like that. Hence, writing a short film for somebody, I'm always open to it. Mm-hmm. Most people don't. And that was sort of my mentality when it came into filmmaking, is that it's like, collaboration is way more difficult when you're not being paid. There's no incentive other than two people wanting the exact same kind of success or thrill for successfully creating something together. I just find it more harder than not to get people to join up and get on the same page. If you can find that person, that's the best, right? There's nothing better than that. But I find it's a little more rare, at least for me, in my experience.
Well, I think, it definitely would be more rare, because it's not how most screenplays are written. It's like you have a writer, maybe on different levels of the industry, they'll have someone else will do a rewrite or whatever. But
right.
You hear about that, I guess. But it tends to still be maybe not so much for television, because I think that's more like a writer's room scenario. But for features, it is more the individual voice that tends to be the way that it ends up, getting made.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask also, because we've talked about some of your features, process, trying other things, like whether it's like, hey, have you worked with other people or done shorts and that kind of thing, coming back to screenplays and all that. But you mentioned reading Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
Do you, and also one of the whole reasons we're here is because the connection we have through this book. You write a lot. Do you, it sounds like you read a lot as well, right? Like whether it's screenplays or books and stuff, is that a big part of, your routine and what you do?
Yeah. Another philosophy on writing would be, you can't be a writer if you're not a reader. It does surprise me sometimes how many people want to write scripts, but they don't read scripts. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I find that a lot of people don't do it or haven't read a lot of them. And I'll be the first to admit, I have not read a ton. I've read, maybe a couple dozen, maybe close to like 3 dozen. But if you want to be someone who's going to write a bunch of scripts, at least to keep writing them like I have, I would totally recommend grabbing some screenplays, whatever your favorite movies are, and then reading them. Most of them you can find online pretty fast. They're out there.
And sometimes earlier drafts.
Earlier drafts,
like,
sure.
Well, I read on IMSDB, Internet Movie Script Database, for those of you at home who want to read something. IMSDB, I don't know if it's still there, because I read this years ago, but I read the script for V for Vendetta.
How was it?
It's totally different than the movie, like the version that was up there. I had read the graphic novel, watched the movie. I really have a high opinion of that movie. The script that I read was like a perfect mesh between the graphic novel and the film, because the two have almost nothing to do with each other.
Right.
Eventually it was, that's a cool looking guy with the Guy Fawkes mask. Let's make an action, let's make this other movie with him. Even the message and themes of the film versus the graphic novel are not compatible with each other. Two totally different things. Not that one's better than the other, but they're just different. But I read the script for it. It was actually, I think it was the first script I read on IMSDB. And I was amazed. I'm like, wait, am I allowed to be reading this right now? Like, don't they have these earlier drafts under lock and key? But it was right there, and it was, it was really, it was cool. Like, it was just strange, because I was expecting to read the script of a movie that I liked, and
sure,
but it was totally different. It had a lot of scenes from the graphic novel in it that aren't in the movie,
right?
And the messaging, like just what it was all about, was different still. So at some point, you might not know this, you might not be able to tell by watching the movie. At some point, somebody read that graphic novel and wrote something,
right?
And that was just another weird insight into the process of how things change. as well. Right now, I'm kind of reading Killers of the Flower Moon, the script for it. You. Yeah, thank you. I watched the movie.
Did you like that movie?
I did. The thing that I've found with Scorsese films, which I think I've confessed on this podcast before, is sometimes the first time I might say you a few times, I mean me.
The royal you.
Sometimes you watch a Scorsese film and immediately you're like, yes, awesome.
Sure.
Goodfellas. Gangs of New York might be my favorite movie of his. I just think it's amazing. I just think it's incredible. But he made a film called Silence. 2016, almost nobody knew it was coming out, I guess. I'm not sure a whole lot of people went to see it. It has Adam Driver, Andrew Garfield, Liam Neeson, and a whole lot of really great Japanese actors in it.
Kind of a flop.
And yeah, it was. And the person who, I think it was the producer on it, was on a roundtable interview one time. All these big producers, Hollywood producers, and the last question they were all asked was, what was your proudest day on the job? Or like, what's the project you're most proud of? Something like that. And she said the day we wrapped Silence was the proudest day of my career. Because they had been wanting to make that since Gangs of New York came out. All right, like you can see the old Charlie Rose interview of Scorsese. Charlie Rose, so what are you doing next? You make Gangs of New York, and they're already asking you what you're going to do next, right? And he says, well, there's this book I'm reading called Silence, and I'd really like to adapt it. More than 10 years later, he finally gets this thing made. And so I was waiting for this movie like forever. And I love Japanese film, and I'm like, oh, Scorsese, and what's this gonna be? Is it like? Sure. And I didn't read the book. I'm like, is this about samurai? What's going on? And I go see the movie, and the entire time I'm just like, I don't know what I'm looking at here. I don't get it. Like, I'm not sure if this is a good... And when it was done, I was like, I don't know if that was a great movie or not. And part of it was because I'd never seen a movie that was about what that film is about, which is also weird because a lot of the subject matter I was raised with like learning about missionaries and like some of these stories that have a continuity with what that film is about. And like hearing about it since I was a little kid, but never like seeing it, and then seeing a movie about that particular thing. And then also there's just stuff that happens in that movie that I hadn't seen in another film before. And I was like, I wasn't like, oh, this is awesome the whole time I was watching it. I wasn't really sure what I even felt, except for one scene in it. And there was a lot of things I was like, it didn't seem to me like there was even a whole lot going on the first time that I watched it. And then several weeks went by, and I kind of realized I can't stop thinking about this movie. Like, the scenes keep playing over and over in my head again and again. Like, just wherever I was, I'd keep thinking about this film, like, pretty much on a daily basis. And then I watched it again with someone else who hadn't seen it. And I was like, I think this is a great movie. And it's just taken me a while to get it. And then the fifth time I watched this movie...
So many times.
The fifth time I watched it, I realized this is an extremely underrated, brilliant masterpiece. It's the greatest Christian film that's ever been made, and it's not even close. And I will... like gently defend and maybe slowly die on that hill, but I will defend it. I can. And that movie made me realize I have to rewatch all of his films, and including the ones I already liked. And so for Killers of the Flower Moon, part of that with a lot of its subject matter is stuff that even though I'm not really personally acquainted with the Osage Nation, I have connections with a lot of different native groups in North America. And a lot of those stories I'd actually heard before, even though I didn't personally know any Osage. I had heard that story, not read the book, but in Boy Scouts had been told about the Osage Indians and the oil and like what had happened. You know, it's like, yeah, I actually learned about that in Boy Scouts, you know.
Sure.
And because I was very fortunate with the leadership that I had in my troop, and also just like in the council area, there were a lot of people who were from different Native nations and who were active in them, who taught that kind of thing. And so I was like, I had an amazing experience with that. And then since Scouts into adulthood, I've had how to say, I've kept up with it and still, have connections and, done, whether it's documentary filmmaking on reservations and all that. So, and a couple other projects. Just relationships. In fact, even on this podcast, we had Uncle Leon on, which was a departure from what we normally do on the podcast. Normally, it's media-based stuff, but Leon was in town, and I was like, I really want to interview you, and it was fascinating because it's a guy I knew for a while, but I was like, I really don't, like, who are you? Where were you born, man? And, but yeah, so Killers of the Flower Moon, there were aspects to it that there were things happening. I was like, I don't get this yet. But I, at this point, have so much faith in Scorsese that he's not just phoning it in with a film. Sometimes, like, I've seen a film Robert De Niro did at one point that I think he might have just wanted to, maybe he was friends with someone involved on it, or maybe he wanted to put more groceries on the table. I don't know. But when it comes to, and I guess everybody has projects like that, maybe, but
you'd be surprised how many films are that.
Yeah, I've been on Tubi looking up stuff, and I'm like, Mark Hamill's in this thing, Ian McKellen's in this thing, like for a scene on a green screen or whatever, where someone got him for like an hour,
Sure.
And it's like, oh, cool, that's just part of it. It's like, you have your jobs you do. But when it came to that one, especially with Killers of the Flower Moon, the lead actress in it, I had seen in Reservation Dogs, and she has the best scene in the show so far that I've seen. I'm not fully caught up. But, yeah, I did like the film. There's a lot of things that were just apparently refreshing about the direction in it. Like, oh, look, we're going from setup to setup instead of cutting from close-up to close-up the whole time. Thank you, Scorsese, for being a classic director in that regard, But there's things about that film where I'm like, I didn't get it all the first time. There are parts of it where I'm like, I'm not sure what's really going on in this scene. I have followed the story, But I got the same feeling that I kind of had when the first time I watched Silence, which was, I'm not sure if I like this or not, but I think it's because I'm not totally, like, this guy's doing something new again that I haven't dealt with before, and I need to, even though I was kind of familiar with the subject matter, it's like, this guy's doing something that I haven't really dealt with before, as like just watching movies, cinema. This guy, one of the reasons why he's, maybe the best working filmmaker today, for my money, is because he still explores cinema. It's just one of the things he does, but he'll do something that other people haven't done. And then everybody starts copying that thing.
Sure.
It's not just like what his movie's about, but it'll be like a technique. Like he'll do something, even just like the opening of Silence. Like the beginning of that movie, I was like, just like the very first things that happen in it, I'm like, I don't think I've seen a movie start like this before. He's just starting with that, or like Wolf of Wall Street, the end of that movie. Like, there's so many things. I was like, this guy is, it's not a hot take to say he's great, but part of what gets it for me is he'll make something and I don't always get it. And it's not because he isn't doing anything. It's because I haven't learned this language of cinema yet. I don't know this vocabulary because he just discovered it. And I think that's what happened with some of it for it. There was a lot of it I loved. I'm like, this is amazing. I love Killers of the Flower Moon. This is an amazing movie. And there were parts of it where I'm like, there's something here that I don't understand. So that's my long way of saying, yes, I liked it, but I think I'm going to like it more the more I see it, and I'm going to. So, yeah.
That's a fair analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you like it?
No.
No?
No.
Yeah.
But I mean, but I haven't given
That should be its own clip for this. Just be like me.
It
like,
really should be.
Scorsese.
Yeah. That's hilarious. No. But
That's great.
I have not given it another shot. I try to be fair with most filmmakers, like you have with Scorsese, watching multiple times, right? You watch the first time, kind of not clicking with you. You go over it a few more times, and then you're like, okay, finally I'm getting it. For me, no, I wasn't a huge fan of Killers of the Flower Moon, but I don't know if it will change because of what my opinion is of the picture. And really what that comes down to for me is I don't think Scorsese has any business making it. He told a story about Native Americans who got robbed of a birthright, and he told it from the point of view of a white person, thus robbing the point of view of the Native American to tell the story. And to me, it's like everything about that picture, the way that it's done, goes against everything that he's proclaiming to be against, right? Like he's saying like, oh yeah, the white people took all this stuff from them. And it's like, I don't think a white guy has any business really making it. Not at this point. We've done that a lot, over the years. And I think it's time to turn a corner on that. Like we could say like, oh, but there are Native American actors and actresses, and we, went with Native Americans to get their okay on the picture. When I have a friend who worked on that movie, and Scorsese, during the making of it, was asking in production meetings, saying like, could we be doing the wrong thing here by telling it from the white person's point of view? Like he had that reservation. And I think that he was, his team was like, no, we're fine. And in my head, I'm like, no, you were on the right track. You had doubts about it. Those were my doubts as a viewer watching it. I'm probably in the minority whenever it comes to that.
Should be a little ironic, wouldn't it?
I'm probably in the minority on it, but that's my takeaway. Now, I love Scorsese, so I give him a pass for not liking one of his pictures, or I'm fond of I think Goodfellas is a really fun movie. And I love early Scorsese. After Hours is a blast.
Have you seen Mean Streets?
I love Mean Streets. Mean Streets is really good.
Maybe one of the most realistic brawl fights I've ever seen in a movie.
Yeah, it's great.
Weird. I'm like, that looks like a real fight.
handles violence really well. Now I know on my wife's episode, you guys talked a bit about, and I'm glad that we got into Scorsese, because I was like, I don't want to bring it up, but if we naturally go there, I totally will. But you guys did mention, like, I think she had said on her episode that you had mentioned The Silence. And
yeah, now, you mentioned it. Yeah, we did talk about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think she mentioned that I'm a big fan of The Last Temptation of Christ, which is also a Scorsese flick.
Well, I will make a slight confession here. I haven't seen it yet. Not because I don't want to.
Sure.
But I do watch movies, and you'd be shocked at the films that I haven't seen. But
it happens all the time.
I am aware that he made that, and I'm like, fascinating, because he made this one. What about that?
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I would highly recommend watching it. It is kind of difficult to watch, because it's not scripture. And most stories, if not all of them, about Christ are scripture, or at least they're based on that. Watching The Last Temptation of Christ gets more into the philosophy of Christ and kind of pulls away from what the scripture is. And it flat out states that in the very beginning. And it's based on a book that does the exact same. But I always applauded Scorsese for making it. I mean, it was protested whenever it came out. I think it was banned for a hot minute.
Probably. Back then, especially. What wasn't,
Sure. Well, things still, it still happens today, probably more often than you think. But yeah, that picture of his, I think, is very bold, and it's not my favorite of his, but I do appreciate that he went for the telling of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's go back a bit to Killers of the Flower Moon for a second. You're talking, when you say you were talking with someone who had worked on it, and Scorsese's having these reservations about the film, and your thoughts on him not having any business telling this story from that perspective, because the book, I haven't read the book, Killers of the Flower Moon. My mother has, and I believe the film isn't from the perspective of the Leonardo DiCaprio character, even. So I think that was like even a change from. I'm not sure that it is told from a certain person's perspective or not, the book itself. But from what that's something that some people have brought up, not just you, even though, like you said, you may be in the minority, but I've heard different people bring that up as either an observation or a criticism of the film. I'm personally hesitant to say that anybody doesn't have a business making a film about almost anything.
Sure.
It's like I take that into maybe less potentially politically charged topics. And it's like Steven Spielberg's not a combat veteran. I don't think you have to be a combat veteran in order to make a movie about combat, and I mean, if you are, maybe it helps. Oliver Stone, combat veteran, made Platoon, pretty incredible movie. And a lot of it's basically, if you watch the commentary of it, it's basically an autobiography with he just kind of put things in an order that a story happens and gave a bit of a, I don't know if you call it a resolution, but the entire commentary is him like, oh yeah, I did this, and oh yeah, that happened, and which is crazy to see. But whether someone is a part of what they're depicting or not, something that I think about is that we call it a Martin Scorsese film, or a Christopher Nolan film, but movies aren't just made by one person.
Right.
I think sometimes even though I'm very much like my thing is directing, I also have the view that maybe the position of director is a little overhyped sometimes. I'm kind of, I understand why, but it kind of surprises me that the director of photography isn't known as much as the director is. On films, unless it's Roger Deakins, and very well deserved there, sir. But is this something that you've, I don't know, just the topic of who can or can't or shouldn't make or has no business making different things, is that something that you think about with other films that come out, or is that a topic that you mull on a lot, or that's coming to your writing at all? Sure.
Well, that's a good point, bringing it into writing, right? Because what business do I have to write about a serial killer, right? I'm not a serial killer. I don't know anything about that, nor am I, a victim in any sense of anything. I'm a white guy, I'm hardly a victim in most things, but I guess to rephrase that is, you mentioned Oliver Stone, right? Mm-hmm. Making Platoon. So Oliver Stone has every reason to make Platoon. This is a dude who was in Vietnam. He's had those scenarios. He knows exactly what it feels like to have, your sergeant tell you got to go into the field when you're like, I'm not going to come back out. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm sure he was that guy. So he's got every reason to make Platoon. Mm-hmm. And yeah, Spielberg, is not a war veteran, right? And he made Saving Private Ryan, and it's a great movie. I love Saving Private Ryan. But I think, it would be equivalent to Oliver Stone making Schindler's List, right? Oliver Stone's not Jewish. He has no idea what it means to his family about people who survived the Holocaust, right? He understands it in a textbook format. But as far as, Steven Spielberg understanding it, it's a lot different, right? Spielberg understands what the Holocaust is, probably because his family members survived the Holocaust, or someone knows somebody who did. And he's able to tell this very personal story about his Jewish heritage and what it means to understand, fascism and Nazism, and as a group of people, how terrifying that scenario was for everybody. And thus that movie comes out way more personal, right? So it's more akin to that, where Scorsese doesn't know a thing about what the Native Americans feel as far as being ostracized by a group of white people.
Are you sure about that?
I would, well, I mean, not in the sense of Native Americans. That would be the stance I would take on it. You could educate yourself as much as you want to, but I don't think that it would translate over in the same way. Now, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe his family does understand that.
Do you think maybe that's why he had it told from the perspective of Leo's character?
And there's sort of the rub on it, right? Is that maybe that is it, right? Where he's going to tell it from that point of view. To me, then that movie comes off like The Irishman. See, The Irishman, what's interesting about that movie is that it's another gangster story that Scorsese's going to tell. Personally, I don't think Scorsese needs to make another gangster movie.
I'd watch it.
Oh, no, I did, too. And I actually liked The Irishman.
So did I.
I think it's a fun movie. What I really liked about it was that he's got 3 guys who are classic actors for the mob movie. Mm-hmm. And he put them all together to give what felt like a swan song to the mob films. And that's great because he's like one of the great, mafia filmmakers, meaning filmmakers that make something about mafia. And he took the 3 actors that he's worked with before and was like, I'm just going to use them and it's going to be awesome. And it ends up being like a farewell letter, I think, to making those kinds of movies. And then when telling a story about Native Americans, and again, maybe I need to rewatch it, but then I'm watching it and I'm like, okay, it feels like Scorsese now is taking 2 of his top actors and reusing them to put them in this picture when, to me, from a story point of view, the story that's more interesting is really from the wife, right? I mean, like, let's break it down. For me, for my money, what I think is as a viewer, right? Not even as a writer, just as a viewer. If I'm told 2 stories I could watch, one about a guy who is deceiving his wife and trying to steal everything from her, and he's in connection with his uncle, and it's a corruption story, and we're going to watch how he's taking everything away from her, but it's a love story. But at the end of the day, you kind of know that he is not really in love. He's not really in love with this woman, right? He's not really in love with her because how could he be if he's going to do all this? That's like Scorsese's pitch on this story, right? Is that it's a true love story. Oh man,
that's all right. Don't worry about it.
That his whole thing is that it's a love story between these 2. They love each other. But the whole time I'm watching it, I don't feel like Leo loves this woman at all, right? So for me, this is like the pitch is that Scorsese's like, let's watch a movie about a guy who's going to deceive this woman this entire time. We're going to be aware of it. We know that she's not aware of it. He's like slowly poisoning her with insulin, which I think is what he was giving her the whole time, or something that's like not letting her live to her fullest potential. And he's in cahoots with his uncle. Or you could do the story from the point of view of the woman, a woman who fell in love with a white guy, even though it was against her tribe. She didn't listen to them, and she went with her heart. And then she would find out later that she's being backstabbed by him the entire time. To me, that's a much more interesting story, where it focuses on her as a lead actress and keeps her as the center focus of a story. Because to me, Leo being the center of the story is not necessary. There's no real character arc or gain. We just watch a descent that is, and don't get me wrong, there's something to be said about it being, relevant or symbolic to how the American government, treated Native Americans. But it's been done. I've seen it, several times. So if you're going to tell that story, let's see it a little bit differently. I just think it's a failed opportunity.
I think, and I don't know if this is what I was going for or not, part of what I got from it was, in the same way that The Irishman was a swan song perhaps for mob films and all that, having basically a Western told from the, at least, like definitely most of the screen time is Leonardo DiCaprio. All right. There are scenes where it's clearly like we're in one of the natives' heads. All right. Like, spoiler alert, everybody, if I haven't figured it out by now. There's we go into their afterlife. You know, we get their, and maybe there's some ambiguity on whether this is a hallucination or not with the owl coming in, you know. But having a Western that's from the perspective, let's say predominantly at least, from the white characters, but from a perspective of these aren't the good guys, oh, let's go get the Indians, you know, I thought was pretty interesting, actually was new. Not that I mean, there's been times where, you know, whether it's with the evolution of John Ford or like other Westerns that have happened since like maybe Dances with Wolves and afterward, that have kind of been like the, hey, maybe we weren't too nice to those guys, you know, sort of films and shows. But I think there might be a similarity between The Irishman and the Killers of the Flower Moon with like on a thematic level of what you're talking about. My general belief when it comes to making movies is that you can make a movie about whatever you want. When it comes to subject matter that you might not have a personal experience with, maybe even on a cultural level, the main thing to do is research. There's the side of filmmaking that's the visionary artist, and then there's the side which is it's a very technical craft. When veterans of D-Day watched Saving Private Ryan, the reports had been that that's what it was like.
Sure.
You know. And I think that there is merit as well to what you're saying about Spielberg making Schindler's List and having that personal connection with the subject matter. But I think that it's something that people talk about a lot these days. I think about like who can make what or what perspective something's from, like that. I tend to err on the side of I tend to err on the side of you can make a movie about whatever you want. But I'm also very, very, and a bunch of the people I'm working with right now can attest to this, doing your research and the way you do it is absolutely essential. I think it, like, where I would kind of, and you and I would probably fall on the same line of this, is if you're making a film about a group of people who are still around and you don't talk to them about it and don't have them involved on the project, not only is that kind of dumb, and you're robbing yourself of a collaboration to do something truly meaningful there, but I think I would put that on the side of, yeah, that's pretty unethical, on some level.
Sure. And he did all the research, you know, like he went with those groups and he talked with everybody, you know, and got full approval, you know, to make it. Again, this is just one guy's opinion.
No, that's what we're here for.
Yeah. And just because, you know, he's, you know, a white person, that doesn't disqualify him to make the picture. Right? That's not how I mean it. I don't think that, you know, if you're going to make a movie about, you know, Black America, that, you know, you can't make that picture if you're a white person. You could. It just might not hit the same way. That's really the thing. That's how I look at it, right? Like a black person would they would have the ability to tell that story probably a lot better than a white person would, right? Like Spike Lee making Do the Right Thing is way more on point, if he's telling it, because he understands what it's like to be in Brooklyn and to tell that story, right? As opposed to, I don't know, Francis Ford Coppola, who's like
someone who just got the screenplay is like, oh, I'll make this thing. Yeah.
Right. And, and, you know, again, the same applies for, you know, Francis Ford Coppola is able to do The Godfather a lot better because he's like, I'm going to make a gangster movie, but it's going to be very focused on Italian family and values. And he understands that very well, where like someone who's Irish isn't going to get that at the same level. And Scorsese's a master filmmaker, so nothing wrong with that. And he could tell any movie that he wants. And to tell that picture, I think I don't disagree that it's a very important story to tell. But I think from him being the kind of filmmaker he is, and this is kind of where I go into, he's got no business telling it, right? Is that because of the kind of filmmaker he is, he's going to take a very specific point of view when you could probably have a more profound impact from a little bit of a different point of view. And so that's where I land whenever it comes to telling that.
On the flip side of that, it's also if he had told it from the native perspective, I think that he actually probably would have been able to pull that off satisfactorily. Which, by the way, I'm not saying everybody is capable of pulling off everything. Please don't misconstrue anybody. But have you seen Kundun?
No.
So that's the thing that is making me say what I'm saying now, which is if he had taken that other perspective, I think he would have been able to pull it off.
Sure.
You know, it's like there's definitely, I think, because part of it is there's just so many ways to make a movie, you know, and having experience with the culture is is a form of research, even if it's like you were raised in it. It's like you know what you're talking about. And like with Coppola with The Godfather, you know. But it's also like you could take that argument on a lot of ways. It's like, all right, well, it's not like a man can't direct a film or write a script where the main character is a woman. And also, it's not just all the characters are one person. So this is, you know, I see... I think it's fair and valid, especially just where you would find the other perspective more interesting. And I'm not sure that I wouldn't, to be honest. In fact, while I was watching it, I was kind of like, are we going to get more of her? What's going on here? We're getting all these secret room meetings between like the Freemason or whatever the heck was going on in that scene with De Niro and DiCaprio. But yeah, I think it's good to... It's always interesting to see a film and think like, what if someone else was the main character and all that. And then also taking into account the artists behind it. Once again, maybe sometimes people emphasize the director too much. I think when Scorsese's directing, you can't emphasize it enough. But yeah, I'm kind of starting to prattle on in circles here. I'm just really enjoying this conversation.
No,
honestly.
it's a good.
I really like
to
talking about film this way.
Yeah, me too.
And especially when it's like when we get down to this is what you think about just outside of film, like about the world and how you see stuff, and then me and getting on, and we both saw the same movie, and I have a huge explanation for why I like it and why I'm probably going to like it more, and then you've got your no, I didn't like it. And I think that's cool. Well, I'd love to have you on again sometime.
It's been an honor being here.
I feel like even though this went on longer than I got carried away, but I feel like I'm cutting it short, honestly. I really do. We were like, getting into this. I'm like, this is a really cool conversation. But thank you so much for being my guest. Thank you for the advice that you've given me over the years, the ways that you've helped me with stuff, with just like, do you think you should sign this contract?
I didn't know I had that much of an impact.
It really, yeah. I mean, it's only been a few times that we've like been around each other, honestly. Sure. But they had a big impact, and then also the book is good. And
thank you so much for the copy. It's incredible.
I'm so glad that I can finally give that. I've had that for I think 20. It's one of the 20 teens. It's been a weirdly long time.
That's insane.
And just like when occasionally, like if I'm moving or whatever, I'm like, oh yeah, I gotta remember to give that to him. And then when I had Missy on, I'm like, oh, I should have him on the podcast. Yes. Yeah. And then it's just been like, I think you said like maybe a full year since.
That's insane. Yeah. So, it's crazy.
But I wanted to finish reading it first. So,
Did you like it?
A lot of it, yeah. There were parts of it that were... I'm not sure I really totally understood what the book was supposed to be until about halfway through it. You know, because
isn't that ironic?
Right? Yeah, it is. And I realized that while I was doing it, I'm like, oh, that's... I don't know if this guy's playing 4D chess with me or what, but because there were some things where I wasn't sure what kind of advice it was, but it was also like just a manifesto on what is story, where does it come from, and I honestly, the thing that I'd say is the more I got into it, the more I liked it, and the last few chapters of it were really about stuff that I've been thinking of for a long time, but hadn't read a whole lot about. So I got a lot of that out of it as well. I love the way that's set up as well. Just like the way the book's laid out is great.
Sure.
But it was one of those books, much like a couple of the films we mentioned on this episode, that when I was done reading it, I was like, I think I need to give this another go as well. So, and I will. And then I'll just use a different colored pen so I can keep track of what phase of notes I went through with, and like, oh, I changed my opinion. You know, so good stuff.
I've read it twice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you miss stuff.
Right. Yeah.
You gloss over it the first time, but then on a second viewing, you might not gloss over that again because you retain the other stuff, but you missed that portion.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the StudioMEcast, and don't forget to check out John's IMDb page in the description, and also don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I hope that you join us for the next one. Bye-bye. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you want to start your own podcast, why wait? Reach out to us at StudioME.me, and I hope you hear me again soon.